Welcome to another episode of The Breakdown. It is August 7th, 2023, and it has been quite the week in Alberta politics. As always, it seems to be the case. I remember when we used to do two shows a month. Now it's quite regularly two shows a week because there's just that much going on. But that's okay. We're here for it. And we got a lot to talk about tonight. We're going to try to cover a lot of ground, so bear with us as we get right into it. Because we're going to start with the light stuff, and then we're going to work our way to the heavier things. Because there's some heavier topics that we gotta talk about. But to start with the light stuff, let's get right into Mr. Brian Jean. So it turns out that the UCP leadership race, despite having ended literally almost a year ago, isn't quite done yet. Mr. Brian Jean sent out an email this week where he was like, hey, everybody, you know what you probably want to do heading into a long weekend? You probably want to donate money to a leadership race that ended almost a year ago because money's hard and leadership campaigns cost money and there's a deadline looming. So please give me money for my unsuccessful leadership campaign, all predicated under the idea of defending Alberta's energy industry, because that's what he's doing now, I guess, allegedly. But there's a little bit of a fun part to the whole thing. At the end of the email, Mr. Brad Jean wrote, P.S. Almost every UCP leadership campaign ended up in the same situation as Brian's. Many individuals did not know. I want to be the premier. And let's remember that when it was the UCP leadership race, it was, I want to be the premier. That's what they were running for. So you'd think they might have checked up on the rules, but as we've seen for Danielle Smith's time in office, rules, those are to be learned after the Ethics Commissioner investigation. Many individuals did not know that they were capped at $4,300 per year across all campaigns and donated to several campaigns and ended up over-contributing. Donations are capped at $4,300 per capital year per Alberta resident to any combination of political parties, riding associations, election candidates, and leadership candidates. Please bear that in mind while donating, which is wild because here we have Brian Jean saying, hey, people didn't know the rules about donating, but we just finished an election where we had a bunch of people who we were asking them to donate. So if you could go ahead and donate some more, that'd be swell. It's a fascinating tack to take. But what's really interesting is the deadline for contributions was August 6th. So this email went out in what's apparently a bit of a desperate bid for a deadline that passed. I mean, we're recording this on the 7th. This deadline passed yesterday. So he gave his supporters all of like 3 or 4 days to pony up enough to cover the cost of his leadership campaign because they had to refund a bunch of money because a bunch of people over-contributed, and that turns into election fines. But speaking of fundraising, we got our Q2 numbers in, and there's a little bit to unpack here. So to start with, let's go through the broad strokes. The NDP came in at $3.9 million fundraised in Q2. UCP came in at $3 million, just over $3 million, $3,083,000. Now, the trick, as always with the UCP, is the NDP does all of their fundraising via Party Central. So if you want to donate money to the NDP, you donate it to the NDP party. The NDP party then goes, okay, we're going to disseminate it to our constituency associations as we see fit. The UCP fundraises both through Party Central as well as through their constituency associations. So this is why at the end of last year, everybody was like, oh, the NDP are up by so much. And then the constituency association members come in, and it wasn't so much up by so much. So all of the numbers for the UCP and a couple of the other parties as well, those are the numbers that we're looking at today are purely party numbers. So they don't include the constituency associations. But we have the NDP with almost 4 million, the UCP with just over 3 million. Third place, once again, remains a party that we're going to talk about in a little bit more detail in just a sec, but it's a party that people should definitely be paying some degree of attention to because the Alberta Pro-Life Party raised just over $80,000. Now, for context, The Alberta Pro-Life Party raised the combination of the fourth and fifth place party with some room to spare. So they're still fundraising a good chunk of money. In fourth place, the Alberta Party with a whopping $41,019. The Alberta Liberals, who had a leadership race that nobody came to, and their interim leader has now become their for keepsies leader. They raised $34,265. The Green Party came in with $16,569. WIPA, I love this number, $1,008.10. The Wild Rose Loyalty Coalition came in with $836.64. Solidarity Party, that's the Artur Pawlowski, soon to be in September. He's probably going to be in jail for a bit. Artur is. They came in with $505, and the Independence Party came in with $105. Now, let's talk a little bit about the Alberta Pro-Life Party, because they're like the party that's not, even more so than the fourth and fifth places, because the Alberta Liberals, the Alberta Greens, the Alberta Party, even the Artur Pawlowski Solidarity Party, they all say, we're here to be political parties, folks. We're here to do the political partying, whereas the Alberta Pro-Life Party doesn't so much. And they're more than a little bit antagonistic. We saw during the election, they decided to weaponize their political party status more than a little bit when they announced that they were going to be campaigning, and they had their sole candidate's campaign office right in front of the Kensington abortion clinic. So the way that they skirted the election laws and skirted the bubble zones that exist around the abortion clinics is to say, "Oh no, we're a political party campaigning during an election." So they're skirting the rules, but they're doing it quite deliberately for a few different reasons. Now, there's a really great article that was put together a little while ago by Jason Markusoff, where he sort of went through the Alberta Pro-Life Party and their history. And it's a fascinating history, because they're actually a group of people that took over the Social Credit Party. The Social Credit Party being a party that had a little bit of a tenure in the Alberta legislature for a little while there. Bible Bill and all that. The Social Credit Party, though, as the PCs really rocketed to power, the Social Credit kind of lost power. And one day at one of their general meetings, a boatload of people showed up and said, "That's a real nice party you've got there. It's ours now. Thanks." Because it's easier to take over a political party going through AGMs and all of that sort of thing, sort of take back Alberta style. So the pro-life folks were doing the take back Alberta bit before take back Alberta was cool. And they took over the party, and they became the Alberta Pro-Life Party. And they don't make any bones. They're not trying to misconstrue why they're doing this. They're very, very clear as to why they're doing this. On their website, they spell it right out. Charitable pro-life organizations can issue tax receipts, but they can't engage in politics. They would lose their charitable status. Other political pro-life organizations can't issue tax receipts and can only engage in politics outside of provincial elections. Only pro-life Alberta can do both. So they're not campaigning to create a political movement. They're trying to use the entity that is a political party in order to fundraise, to get tax donations for fundraising, and campaigning on a single issue, which is getting rid of women's access to healthcare. That's the third place fundraiser. And they've consistently been the third place fundraiser in the province of Alberta. This is something that people should be paying very, very close attention to, because, like I said, when you take a look at the next two progressive parties after the NDP, we're talking about the Alberta Party, we're talking about the Liberal Party, combined, those two parties didn't raise as much money as Pro-Life Alberta did. Something to probably keep an eye on. Moving on from there, one of the other big stories that came this week had to do with the health restrictions. And this is a story that has already been misconstrued predictably by the freedom folks, the anti-health restrictions, or anti-health protections folks. This is a lawsuit that was brought forward by the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedom, and they won on a technicality. And it's a technicality that it really didn't surprise anyone. The judge in question ruled that even if the proper decision-making framework was in place, Alberta's constitutional rights would not have been violated. So that's the really important thing. So all of the health measures that were put into place, whether we're talking about masking, whether we're talking about limiting gatherings, all of that stuff was not a violation of the Constitution. It wasn't a violation of any laws. What was, though, was the fact that the decisions that were made by the politicians. Now, this is something that a lot of people, we've done a couple of episodes on this. We had more than a couple of legal scholars on the show during the pandemic to talk about this issue. And the issue was that the person who is supposed to have the authority to make the decisions and who is supposed to be making the decisions is the chief medical officer of health at the time. That would have been Dr. Dina Henshaw. But as we saw throughout the pandemic, we had Mr. Kenney come up and stand in front of his whiteboard and talk about how he knew all of the things and he was going to grade school education us all into the pandemic. That wasn't actually his place. And when we're talking about the public health orders that came out, whether we're talking about the masking or the gathering restrictions, those should not have been political decisions. Those are not decisions that should have been made by or influenced by the politicians. Those are supposed to be dispassionate, science-based, evidence-based decisions made by the chief medical officer of health. But in Alberta, the judges ruled that's not what happened. The mandates, the restrictions that were put into place, those were all influenced, if not decisions made by Jason Kenney and his cabinet. And because of that, because it wasn't the chief medical officer of health making the decisions, because Dina Henshaw, for reasons, relegated herself to an advisory role during the pandemic, the judge ruled that those restrictions were not lawful. Now, again, it's really, really important to highlight the only reason why the decisions weren't lawful was because they were made by the premier and his cohorts, and because it wasn't made by the chief medical officer of health. It has nothing to do with whether or not freedoms were infringed, because the judge in the ruling was very clear. While the Alberta government conceded that some of the restrictions infringed on Alberta rights, we've talked about this on the show before, there's this thing called the Oakes test. And the Oakes test determines whether or not infringing on a right is appropriate given the situation. Romaine found others did not. She also ruled the infringements that occurred were amply and demonstrably justified under the Charter because of the nature of the unprecedented public health emergency. So even though it was Kenney and co. who were making the decisions, Dr. Dina Henshaw relegated herself to an advisory role, even with that in mind, the restrictions that were put into place weren't a violation of the Constitution in any sort of undue way. But because Kenney was the one who made the decisions and not Dr. Henshaw, it was decided that the health measures, the restrictions were invalid. So we got a lot of freedom folks who are running around saying, oh, it's a great big win because the restrictions were all illegal and unconstitutional. And on a technicality, yeah, it appears that the judges ruled that they were illegal. But it wasn't that they were illegal because they were unconstitutional. It wasn't that they were illegal because they were overstepping. It was that they were illegal because the proper framework for following those decisions wasn't followed. Now, Danielle Smith's reaction to this has been, well, this just goes to show why we need to listen to God Help Us All, Preston Manning. I wish I was making that up, but I'm not. She's going to ask Preston Manning for his input on how this situation could be avoided in the future. Hooray. Moving on from there. Last week we talked a little bit about the Calgary clinic that got itself in quite a bit of hot water. The Porsche, I still don't know, physician who decided that she was going to charge fees for people who were accessing her clinic. And what really got her into hot water was the fact that she was charging those fees so that you would get in to see a physician quicker, which is queue jumping and a violation of the Canada Health Act. But she also said you'll get extended appointments, and then there's some other fringe benefits. Well, the whole universe exploded, and the Alberta Health spokesperson, Scott Johnson, said that they will not be proceeding with charging fees on August 1st. Now, an important thing to realize in this conversation is they're not going to start their fees on August 1st. That doesn't mean, though, that a definitive decision has been made. And in fact, multiple media outlets, multiple journalists who have been chasing down this story have not been able to get a firm answer from the clinic or the Porsche driving physician who likes to go to Lake Louise every weekend. She said it in the video, not me. As to whether or not they're going to continue to pursue some version of this. Undoubtedly, though, as soon as there is a decision made, that will get leaked to media in record time because there's so much scrutiny on this clinic now. But another conversation came up out of that conversation because in Camrose, there is a clinic called The Art of Caring. And we did a couple tweets on this because it appears that the Art of Caring is a clinic that's offering services exactly like what you would expect from a family doctor. But the big difference is they're charging for them. Now, this got a lot of attention because people were like, well, what the hell? If this physician's clinic in Marda Loop in Calgary can't charge for services, how is it that this clinic called The Art of Caring, who had their grand opening on July 18th, how is it that they are charging $25 for a walk-in appointment or $25 for a routine health concern or a bunch of other different prices? And they did some advertising on the Facebooks. And this is another place where people were kind of like, what the hell's going on here? Did you know that we're open till 7 p.m. on Wednesdays and have Saturday availability? We are open, grand opening July 18th, 2023. We have a special. It's like you're ordering fried chicken, but with healthcare. We have a special on walk-in appointments, $25. We can help with sore throats, respiratory infections, for example, coughs or sinus, urinary tract infections, skin or nail infections, assessment of joint or muscle injuries, and more. The best is in capital letters. The best thing is the short wait time. You don't have to wait for hours to receive assessments, diagnosis, or treatment. So wait a second. All of a sudden, we've got this rapid, short wait time going on. What's going on here with the Art of Caring? And this is where it gets really complicated really quickly because the person who's the owner and operator of the Art of Caring clinic isn't a physician. She's what's called a nurse practitioner. This gets contentious and it gets complicated really, really quickly because nurse practitioners have a scope of practice depending on their area of practice that is very, very similar to physicians. Now, it's a little bit different in some places in regards to, there's a couple of small differences in regards to what can be prescribed. There's a couple of other small differences into some of the treatments, but they have a scope of practice that's very, very similar. Now, why is it that this nurse practitioner is able to charge private and run a private clinic that is offering to essentially duplicate the services of most walk-in clinics or family doctor clinics? It's because a physician in Alberta can bill the province for the services that they provide. There's a billing pathway for them to be ordered to do that. Nurse practitioners don't have that pathway. So there's no pathway for a nurse practitioner to offer a private or to offer a service in a clinic and directly bill the government. There's just no mechanism for that to happen. So it's perfectly legal for nurse practitioners to open up a clinic and to charge for private healthcare, for administering and delivering private healthcare. Now, this is one of the things that Danielle Smith talked about in her leadership campaign. And it's something that the association that represents nurse practitioners has said, hey, you know what? We'd love to have that, though. That'd be swell, because as it is right now, the only options that are available for nurse practitioners are to get hired in an environment like Alberta Health Services, where they're working collaboratively, or they have to open up these private clinics. Now, we had a couple conversations with some nurse practitioners over the last week, because this was it was a spicy little meatball of an issue. There's a lot of physicians who are very, very quick to say, hey, you know what? They may have similar scopes of practice, but they don't have the same amount of training. They don't have the same depth of training. They're not the same thing as physicians. And there's a lot of nurse practitioners who are very, very quick to say, hey, but we have pretty much the same scope of practice. And when we're talking about primary care, we can do most of the things that you can do. So it turned into I can do this as much as anyone can. No, you can't. Yes, you can. No, you can't. Yes, you can. That old song. It turned into that pretty quick. But one of the questions that we posed to a couple of these nurse practitioners that we spoke to was, is it not conceivable that, I don't know, a company, let's pick a random company name that has demonstrated an interest in private healthcare. I don't know. Let's call them Mellis, just for fun, not related to any current company whatsoever. That's just the name that popped into my head. Mellis, with an M, to be very clear. Let's say that Mellis decided that they wanted to expand private healthcare delivery options. Could they not hire 50 or 60 nurse practitioners and put them in clinics across the province and say, hey, it's the Mellis Babylon network of nurse practitioners? Is that something that they could do? And every single nurse practitioner that we spoke to said, yeah, they could do that. So it's going to be fascinating to see how the province chooses to deal with this, because Danielle Smith has made a strong argument. Hey, you know what? Albertans should get a health spending account. And she talked about having a $300 health spending account. Well, that would be, at the rate of $25 an hour, that would be 6 visits to a GP, which is more, well, not a GP, a nurse practitioner who's offering the same services ostensibly as a GP. That's more than most people go to see their family doctor. It's really easy to see how Danielle Smith could construct an argument and how this particular pathway could create a loophole for a private, for-profit healthcare delivery system. Now, where it gets really interesting, though, is when we start to talk about private, for-profit healthcare, they start to offer things that you wouldn't normally see offered by a GP. And some of the things that Art of Caring are offering are really quite fascinating, because one of the things that they're currently offering is a variety of IV and intramuscular therapies. Now, a lot of these IV and intramuscular therapies are, let's go with, a little questionable when it comes to the evidence-based medicine for them. They have their Boost IV drip, which is going to hydrate, replenish, and enhance. I'm not sure what enhance means. They've got their NRG. It's like energy, but only 3 letters. So the savings are just everywhere. IV drip that energizes, rejuvenates, and regenerates and strengthens. They've got a Radiance IV drip. They've got an Immune. So it's not immune. We're not saying immune. It's just M-Une IV drip, which protects, repairs, and supercharges. We're not saying you're going to be able to lift cars, but it supercharges you. There's a lot of questions to be had here. But this is what private healthcare delivery can look like. And this is a conversation that the province needs to be willing to have going forward, because as it stands right now, there's no legislation that's been talked about. There's been no legislative changes that have been talked about to bring nurse practitioners into that billing flow that would allow them to bill the government. So right now, to be clear, for a nurse practitioner to open up a clinic in Camrose and offer Immune, I'm sorry, IV therapy, that's a perfectly legal thing to do. Do with that what you will. Moving on from there and continuing on in the healthcare conversation, there's a lot more that's been going on in the province of Alberta. One of the big topics that has been a lot of people talking about has to do with the laboratory situation. So as we talked about, and we've talked about it on a few episodes, but we spent a little bit of time on it last episode. One of the things that's been going on is with the UCP deciding that they were going to go in the complete opposite direction of providing lab work across the province. So the NDP wanted to bring it all into the umbrella of Alberta Health Services, build the super lab up in Edmonton. The UCP said, how about we don't do that and we just privatize everything? How would that be? We're going to give it all to a company called DynaLife. They've sworn on a stack of Bibles they'll be able to do it without any problems. So we're going to do that. Well, it turns out there's problems, and quite a few of them, because in areas where DynaLife hasn't historically operated, there have been a lot of problems. So, for example, Edmonton has not seen the major problems that other areas of the province have seen, because Edmonton has had lab services through DynaLife for quite some time. Where DynaLife hasn't been operating is Calgary. And in Calgary, some of the reports about wait times and people having to wait to get lab work has been really quite terrible. It's been very bad. And a lot of people have been raising the alarm about it. Well, this week, there was a couple of different actions that were taken. So first of all, Danielle Smith announced that patients, particularly in the Calgary area, are waiting too long to access routine lab services. To improve access to lab testing, Alberta Health Services and DynaLife have made the joint decision to allow Alberta Precision Laboratories, APL, to offer more community lab appointments. APL already handles lab work in all hospitals and urgent care centers in the province and offers community lab services in rural areas. The quote from Smith: "It is unacceptable that Albertans are facing constant delays to get a simple test or blood work done. Lab tests are a critical part of a patient's healthcare journey from diagnosis to treatment, and Albertans must be able to access them when and where they need them. That's why we've directed Alberta Health Services to make changes right now." Where this gets complicated, though, is how some of those changes are being brought into place. HSAA, which is the union for lab folks, has raised the concern that HSAA lab professionals working in Alberta Precision Laboratories, or APL, are taking extra shifts to help address the crisis of laboratory service wait times in Calgary. So, in order to address the failures of DynaLife being able to roll out, one of the things that's happening is existing employees are having to take overtime shifts, and they're being paid overtime to do this. And Danielle Smith has even admitted, oh yeah, no, this is costing way more money. It's totally costing way more money, but it's the right thing to do. Well, if they hadn't broken it in the first place, they wouldn't have to do it. But one of the other things that's kind of interesting is they're also allegedly bringing in another private company to help. ASO, Akeso, I don't know, Medical, which is based out of Stony Plain, Edmonton. They are, we're told, going to be operating vans to provide extra lab services at some of the busier facilities, particularly in Calgary. So again, we're leaning on the private sector because of a decision that was made to privatize public health care. It's a fascinating time to be alive. It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. But one of the important things to realize is that, as we've seen this week, it's not just lab services that are being overwhelmed. Despite Danielle Smith's promise that she was going to fix the EMS situation, everything in EMS was going to be resolved, there have been lots of reports on social media over the last couple of weeks that resolved isn't quite the right word for it. Dumpster fire might be a little bit more accurate. We shared this DM earlier in the week where we received from a Calgary firefighter: EMS in Calgary broke again. Multiple serious calls and no ambulances. Fire is trying to help, but we can only do so much. Extended steam times extended scene times with a limited scope is infuriating and stressful. So to be clear, what that Calgary firefighter is saying is that there are major emergencies that are happening. The fire department is going to respond to those major emergencies and are waiting for ambulances that aren't available to show up and help them. And the frustrating part that they're referring to is most fire departments, particularly the fire department in Calgary, has a scope of practice, or the skills that they can do to help a patient is really quite limited. It's certainly not at the level that you would get once the ambulance arrives. And to be put in a position where you're responding, but you don't have the tools in your toolbox to be able to help that patient, one can only imagine how frustrating, and to use that firefighter's words, infuriating that's got to be. So as much as Danielle Smith promised and swore up and down that she was going to get the EMS situation resolved, the fact that we are once again seeing first responders reaching out to us here on our show and saying, yeah, that's super not the case. Everything's broken and people are not getting the care that they're supposed to be getting in a timely fashion. That is quite remarkable. But the unfortunate part of the situation, one of the unfortunate things of the situation, is that because of the way that the system's constructed, unless those firefighters speak out, there's no way for the general population to be aware of how serious the situation actually is. Because until you're in a situation where you need that ambulance to come to your door, you don't know that maybe you're just getting a bunch of firefighters for a little while. And I want to be really clear. I'm not dunking on firefighters at all. That's not what we're saying here tonight one bit. Firefighters are really, really good at fighting fires. They can do some things in medical emergencies, not trying to minimize that one bit. And if your house is on fire, you want to know that the fire department is going to be able to get there in a timely fashion. And they do. So I'm not dunking on the firefighters here, but as much as you should be able to expect firefighters to show up when your house is on fire, it shouldn't be unreasonable to expect that when there's an emergency and you're calling 911 for help, that you get somebody who's appropriate to respond to that medical emergency. This is going to be something, obviously, that we're going to be watching fairly closely over the next little bit. Because it is a big issue that does affect a lot of Albertans. Moving on from there, this one's a big one. We got to talk about renewables, because one of the things that happened this week on August 3rd, and this gets to be important for a whole bunch of different reasons. You'll see why in just a minute. The province of Alberta announced that they would not be approving any new renewable projects for, initially it was reported at 6 months. It actually looks like it's much closer to 7 months. They wouldn't be approving any new projects. And there's been a variety of different justifications that have been provided for this. One of the justifications that we've heard from Danielle Smith is, hey, you know what? There's a lot of people who, they don't want to see the big wind turbines near their houses. They don't want to see these solar farms. And, you know, if you're putting solar farms on good agricultural land, you only get solar for so much time. She on her radio show, which we're going to talk about in a bit, she shared a story about how when she was driving through her constituency, she saw solar farms that had snow on them, and those solar panels weren't collecting any energy there. So that's not great. That's not how we should be using that land. One can't help but wonder how exactly one should be using farmland when it's 30 below. Presumably not for growing broccoli, but I'm no farmer. Maybe I'm reading the room wrong. That's been one of the justifications. Another one of the justifications is, hey, we've got this huge orphan wells problem. We don't want to have that problem with solar panels and wind turbines. We got to make sure that there's an established cleaning framework. And then there's also been justifications that have been used saying, hey, you know what? We got to make sure that our electrical grid is reliable. And the way that it keeps being presented is if Danielle Smith is rebuilding the electrical grid from scratch, and that's not what's happening either. But this 7-month moratorium has had some major impacts. And just for context, since 2019, almost $5 billion has been invested in renewable energy products in Alberta, generating enough power, enough electricity to power more than 1 million homes. So renewables aren't this like small little abstract, oh, it's a nice idea. I got a solar panel. I charge the batteries on my trailer. That's not what we're talking about at all here. We're talking about enough power to power 1 million homes. So this is big league stuff. Where it gets to be particularly problematic, though, in regards to the environment for Alberta, is there are 91 projects that are waiting or preparing for permitting approval. Those 91 projects represent at least 25 billion, that's with a B, and over 30,000 job years that are affected by this announcement. So that's a boatload of jobs and a boatload of investment that has been put on hold. Now, as much as we talked about since 2019, there's enough power generated to power 1 million homes. These projects, these 91 projects, would be able to power almost 5 million homes, or around 25% more than Alberta's current peak system load. So these projects would have a major impact on the amount of power that's available. All of these projects have now been told, hey, you know what would be great? Maybe if you could just take your 25 billion and sit on it for a little while. That's cool, right? We're a stable environment for you to invest in. We promise, just wait 7 months. One of the justifications that has been used is that this was requested by the powers that be. Again, citing the rural concerns. This is where we get back to the arguments about like, oh, I don't know if that's the best use of that land. And, we got to make sure that we have a way to clean up the solar panels because they're known for leaching into the soil. No, wait, that's abandoned wells. But that's one of the justifications that Danielle Smith has thrown up there. Now, never mind. Let's just ignore for a second that we're not talking about these solar farms or these wind farms being built without the owner's permission. That's something that historically has only happened with oil and gas. But if I own Bob's Solar and I decide that I want to build a solar farm out in southern Alberta somewhere, I have to make sure that I have the approval. If I don't own the land, I have to make sure that I have the approval of the owner and a contract signed with the owner. So we're talking about people building infrastructure on private land. Now, it could very well be really, really good agricultural land, but there's also a whole lot of really, really good agricultural land around the city of Calgary that has been used for housing. So who is to say whether or not it should be a housing development or whether or not it should be a solar farm? Well, apparently, Danielle Smith in the province of Alberta want to weigh in on that because some people don't like driving by solar farms that have some snow on them, I guess. But this is where we got to take a look at some of the letters that are involved, because there's 2 letters that appear to have kicked this all off. One of them comes from the Alberta Utilities Commission. And this Alberta Utilities Commission is saying, in effect, hey, we're getting a lot of applications for power plants. There's a lot of people who want to build solar plants. There's a lot of people who want to build wind plants and thermal plants and all of these things. We're a little overwhelmed here, and we're not sure how to proceed. The 2 issues that come to I'll read from the letter here. 2 important issues have come to the forefront of the Commission's public interest considerations: the development of power plants on high value agricultural land. So again, regardless of who owns it, apparently, and the lack of mandatory reclamation security requirements for power plants. Now, again, we're talking about renewable power plants, so it's a little bit different than, say, a oil well. And then they said, hey, you know what? We need to do a big a review. We need to do some effective resolution after a period of engagement with all of the stakeholders to get some government direction and figure out how we're going to proceed. That was the letter from the Alberta Utilities Commission. Now let's take a look at the date on that letter because it gets to be really important really quickly. That letter was sent from the Alberta Utilities Commission on July 21st, 2023. When was the other letter in question sent? July 21st, 2023. This one also to Nathan Neudorf, the Minister of Affordability and Utilities. Thank you for, and it opens with, thank you for advising us that the government of Alberta will be requesting the Alberta Utilities Commission to hold an inquiry on land use and reclamation issues, and that the AUC attends to review its hearing process with respect to these issues, necessitating a one-time 6-month temporary pause on the AUC accepting new power plant applications. So to be clear, on the same day that the AUC sent a letter to Nathan Neudorf saying, hey, we got a little bit of a problem here. We're kind of overwhelmed. We need to figure out what we're going to do. Yeah, maybe we can get some input from the government. That'd be swell. On the same day, the president of the AESO sent a letter to Nathan Neudorf saying, hey, thanks for the heads up about that 6-month, it's actually 7, moratorium on new power plant applications. So within the space of, let's assume, a standard business day of 8 hours, let's even make it 12, because sometimes we're told life at the legislature runs a little bit late, shields up. They made the decision to look at the AUC's letter and implement the 6-month hold. But again, we have AESO being told, hey, you know what? You're going to get a 6-month delay in any new applications. AESO said, hey, thanks for the heads up, Nathan Neudorf. Albertans didn't find out until August 3rd. Now, there's some specific mechanisms that had to be deployed in order to make this happen, and these come from what are called orders in council. They're basically the Alberta legislative version of an executive order to Americanize the politics. The first one came on August 2nd. And this is where the Lieutenant Governor Council orders the Alberta Utilities Commission to inquire into and report to the Minister of Affordability and Utilities on the ongoing economic, orderly, and efficient development in the operation in the public interest of electricity generation in Alberta. Rena. And then there's a bunch of other words. Basically, the first one is, yeah, we got to do this. We got to do this investigation. We got to do this review. The second order of council came on the same day at 10:10 in the morning. And this is the one that puts in the 7-month moratorium. So to be clear, before there was an even order in council, 2 weeks before the order in councils happened, on the same day that the Alberta Utilities said, hey, we need to figure this stuff out, on the same day that AESO was told, hey, you know what, we're going to be putting a pause on these things, 2 weeks later is when the orders in council happened. And the next day is when Albertans found out. Now, where this gets really fascinating is Nathan Neudorf went on Power and Politics, and he talked about the fact, hey, you know what? I would have loved to have time to consult with all of the stakeholders, but there was a scheduling, and I'm not even joking. He said this glitch. He said there was a scheduling glitch, and they weren't able to get in touch with the right people in the right amount of time. They had 2 weeks, clearly, from the point where they made this decision to the point where they issued the orders in council. And they couldn't find 15 minutes for a Zoom call? It's absolutely mind-blowing. But what a lot of people are actually speculating about this issue, what a lot of people are actually saying is that this is a great way for Danielle Smith to pump the brakes on making sure that renewable development continues in Alberta. And it's another great way to say, hey, you know what? I've been saying for a while, Justin Trudeau, 2035, it's impossible for us to meet that net zero goal, especially if we don't allow people to build renewables for more than half a year. Even renowned economist Trevor Tombe has come out and said, you know what, there's no economic reason for this. This smacks of nothing more than politics. This doesn't make any sense. Political pundits, economists, everybody across the spectrum is going, what's happening here? Why did we have to stop all approvals in order to figure this stuff out? There's no reason to do that. We've never done it before. We've never done it with oil and gas. This looks like nothing more than craven politics. And as the expression goes, if it walks like a duck and it talks like a duck, odds are it's a duck. And we've seen Danielle Smith on more than one occasion lean into the craven politics in order to justify things that she's already said in the past. We're not saying we're going to be doing some FOIPs, but we're going to be doing some FOIPs. One other thing that's worth highlighting is that the rural municipalities of Alberta did issue a statement where they talked about how the RMA has been advocating for changes in the approval process and regulation. And they talk about how there's an important points that need to be highlighted. They also talk about the fact that the renewable energy industry is crucial to the future of rural municipalities and a province and the whole. So they're not even saying, yeah, this pause is great. They're saying, well, these issues do need to be resolved. And they're saying renewables are super, super important. So it seems like there's a little bit of, we got to try to find some balance in this thing because it's a bit of a shit show. But let's be clear. Danielle Smith has identified many, many times that she's a libertarian. She believes that no government should be able to come on your land and tell you what you're going to do. And yet, that appears to be exactly what she's doing. Do with that what you will. Moving on from there, Mr. Mike Ellis, he went and got himself a mandate letter this week, and it's a fascinating little mandate letter. Particularly when we're talking about where Danielle Smith wants to see Mike Ellis take policing. So one of the things that came up, there's 2 points actually that we wanted to draw attention to. One of them was Danielle Smith wants Mike Ellis to review the education and training curriculum for sheriffs so they can assist in a broader scope of policing. That's pretty clear. We've commented for a while on the show now that it seems like Danielle Smith has recognized that she's not going to be able to build herself a brand new provincial police force. But in the same way that Pro-Life Alberta took over the SoCreds, hey, we could certainly build out that sheriff's department. We could expand that. Maybe we could turn that into our provincial police force. Well, you got to have the education and training curriculum before you can have them assist in a broader scope of policing. But secondary to that, there's another point that caught our eye. She wants them to continue to work with local communities to support them with the community policing options they believe will best serve their populations. Hey, RCMP, we're kind of talking about you, it looks like. So we have on one hand Danielle Smith saying, "Oh, it'd be great. Sure, it'd be great if the sheriffs they did more. That would be super awesome." And on the other hand, she's saying, and also local policing. Hey, if people want to make changes to their local policing, then Mike Ellis, who's supervising the expansion of the sheriff, should definitely make sure that all communities are aware of their options. It's pretty telegraphing how far the Danielle Smith wants to take the sheriffs in the province of Alberta. And she's been a fan of the sheriffs for quite some time. But what's really alarming about this is that Mike Ellis and Danielle Smith have some fascinating views on the causes of some of the crime. Now, there was a really, really great article that was recently written where they took a look at some of the statistics involved into where's all the crime at. We hear Mike Ellis talking about the chaos in the urban centers. So bad in the cities. It's open warfare. It's the apocalypse. It's not. And if you take a look at where the majority of crime is happening, it's actually happening rurally. That's not to dunk on rural populations. It's to say that the rural populations need more support. But instead of focusing their efforts on those, Mike Ellis and Danielle Smith, they really want to demonize a certain set of folks. And we saw this when Mike Ellis decided to pinch hit on Your Province, Your Premier with Danielle Smith, where Mike had some thought about homelessness.
Homelessness itself is obviously a very complex issue. That doesn't mean that it's something that cannot and should not be addressed. Of course, it is. Unfortunately, primarily most people that are homeless are affected through severe mental health and addictions issues. And that is part of the approach that we're taking, and the system that we're creating is to address all of that.
No, it's not. We took a look, and when you take a look at the rates of mental health for people who are entering the homeless or the houseless situation, it is almost exactly the same as the general population. When you take a look at the addiction rates for people who are first on the streets, it is almost exactly the same as the general population. Now, there's no question that the longer that people spend on the streets or people experience houselessness for, there's no question that those mental health numbers and those addiction rates absolutely go up, because being houseless can be really traumatic. And when you take a look at what the number one causes of especially addiction, but also mental health are, it's trauma. But here is Mike Ellis saying on the provincially broadcast program, you know what? The homeless people, it's all about the mental health and addiction. People are are houseless because they don't have houses. That's why. And if you take a look at what's driving the houseless situation across not just Alberta, but the country, it has to do with how expensive it is to live places now. But rather than acknowledge that reality, rather than acknowledge that it's harder and harder for people to make ends meet, and that there's an overwhelming number of Albertans who are living paycheck to paycheck. It only takes one very bad day to put them in a situation where if they don't have direct supports, they're going to end up houseless as well. Rather than acknowledge that, because that's something that they could actually do something about, they're going to demonize and stigmatize the homeless and the houseless population by saying, you know what, those homeless, those houseless people, they're all with the mental health and the addictions. But just in case you thought that was the peak level offensive that Danielle Smith and Mike Ellis were able to get to on their program, Danielle Smith really raised the bar.
To somebody who's a recovering addict, as we did during the campaign. We had 2 young girls who came forward because we do have treatment orders for those under the age of 17. Parents have the ability to apprehend their kids and get them into a treatment program. And those young kids, I mean, talk about wisdom. They said the only thing you care about when you're in the throes of an addiction is getting your next fix. Yeah. You don't have free agency. You don't have mental capacity to think about consequences. And they actually asked us, why is this only available to young people? Why wouldn't it be available to anyone who cares about their loved one? And I think that's what we're going to be looking at.
That was Danielle Smith talking about what they're calling compassionate care. It's a nice sounding name. It's compassionate. It's soft. It's nothing but love. But what it actually refers to is taking people and putting them in treatment against their will. Taking away their ability to make their own decisions, apparently because somewhere there's a family member who has decided, not a physician. Let's be clear about that. What she's alluding to there is not that a physician's going to be doing the assessment, but that if a family member decides that Uncle Timmy isn't doing so good, just like Uncle Timmy could say to his own kid, you know what, we're going to put you into treatment because you're a child, they're going to look at pursuing the same sort of pathway for adults. Now, as always, there's a lot to unpack here, but can we just take a second to address that is a gross mischaracterization of what addiction looks like? Because addiction is a spectrum. I know we have people who are listening to this show or watching this show right now who smoke cigarettes. They're addicted to cigarettes. That's an addiction. Are these people completely incapable of navigating their day? Of course not. One of the problems that Nav was going through and still goes through a lot of corporate culture is the fact that there are a lot of what are called high functioning addicts, people who are using substances to try to manage the stress of their jobs, to try to hit peak success, who are absolutely addicted to those substances, but they can figure out which foot to put socks on in the morning. To characterize anybody who's navigating any addiction as being completely without agency, completely unable to make their own decisions, is a gross mischaracterization of what addiction actually is. Now, for sure, there are severe examples of addiction where there are individuals for whom that is their entire world. That also doesn't mean that those people don't get to make their own decisions. The notion that we can mischaracterize addiction and speak in the broadest of terms not only reinforces a lot of falsehoods about what addiction is and the capacity of people who are navigating addiction, but for the Premier of Alberta to share those sorts of dangerous, broad ideas absolutely only further stigmatizes, because again, she didn't say the worst cases of addiction. She said, and I'm really trying not to be derisive about these two young women who navigated their addiction, but to base the entire policy off of the anecdotal experience of two kids, that's not how medicine works. Addictions treatment should be evidence-based, it should be trauma-informed, and it shouldn't be mandatory, because all of the evidence that exists around mandatory treatment, forced treatment, is that not only does it have an incredibly high failure rate, it also has an incredibly high death rate. That's just the reality. And why it is that Danielle Smith is trying to pursue and Mike Ellis are trying to pursue this Nancy Reagan-esque just say no approach to substance use and substance abuse is unbelievably misinformed. And it's unfortunate, and people are going to die for it. Moving on from there. We gotta go back. We gotta talk about this again, because it seems like there's a lot of people who are hoping that this is just going to go away, and it's not. We got to talk a little bit more about the Calgary Stampede. To recap, back in 2017, a lawsuit was launched against the Calgary Stampede and a sexual predator at the Calgary Stampede. In that lawsuit, allegations were made that the Calgary Stampede had been told about the fact that this person who was with the organization for over 30 years and was preying on kids for that period of time. The allegations are that the Stampede was told in 1988. The Stampede responded by threatening the kid who tried to ask for help. And then they were told again in 2008. There's a lot of people who are having a really hard time differentiating between the brand that is Calgary and the organization that failed kids, the organization that allowed a predator free reign. Let's be clear. In these court documents, one of the things that comes up is the fact that there are claims that there's multiple email threads that talk about this predator and his consistent pattern of behavior that was problematic. That was in 2008. It wasn't until criminal charges, a criminal investigation was started in 2014 that the Stampede walked the guy off the grounds, and he later resigned. It took a criminal investigation for the Stampede to finally do something. There are over 70 victims who are part of this. I don't want to call them victims. There are over 70 survivors who are part of this lawsuit. So we're not talking small numbers. And the lawyer for this lawsuit has been very clear that the actual number of survivors is more than that 70. There are some people who have just said, I don't want to be a part of this lawsuit. Where it gets particularly gross is the Stampede admitted liability. They accepted liability. They accepted and admitted negligence. And it stands to reason that a big part of the reason why they accepted particularly the negligence piece is because they allowed this guy free reign of the young Canadians, unrestricted access to all of these kids in this absolutely abusive power dynamic, and they knew about it. But on 2 occasions now, the Calgary Stampede has come out with statements where they have said, hey, you know what? This is super tragic for everybody involved. We hear and respect the concerns that have been raised in the media about what the Stampede knew and when. We took immediate action upon learning of the allegations in 2014. And with the settlement agreement, the Calgary Stampede takes responsibility and acknowledges that we should have known much sooner. For this, we're truly sorry. Except the court documents seem to say, hey, you know what? You did. And some of the survivors are pretty pissed off, rightfully so. One of the plaintiffs in the sex abuse lawsuit is very upset. Here's the segment from that story. I'm very disappointed that the Stampede has chosen to make a public statement which includes a half-hearted apology tied to the idea that they acted in a timely way, wrote Carson Jensen, a lawyer with JSS Barristers. The evidence does not support this statement, and no apology will be meaningful unless it is complete, genuine, and accompanied by appropriate compensation. So let's just be crystal clear here. There are court documents that have been introduced that say the Stampede knew way earlier. But rather than take ownership of that, what the Stampede appears to be doing is saying, well, yeah, but what if we just say that we acted like we didn't know till 2014? Yeah, you might have some emails and stuff, but if we just say it publicly and repeatedly and we get the premier of the province to repeat it, maybe eventually people will just go, oh, no, they didn't know till 2014. Maybe people won't hear about the 2008. Maybe people won't hear about the 1988. Maybe we can just rewrite history enough that we'll be able to protect our brand instead of taking full responsibility for the environment that we created and fostered for decades. Maybe we can go that route. That's what the Stampede appears to be doing. There's some comparisons that need to be made here. During the UCP's first administration, back in 2021, in shockingly similar circumstances, there were allegations that the Alberta Teachers Association knew about a similar situation where a teacher had been abusing kids, had been bullying kids, and allegedly had been sexually assaulting kids for years. And that the ATA, Adriana LaGrange, then Minister of Education, was very, very quick to say, hey, the ATA knew about all this. They didn't know anything. This is unacceptable. We're going to change the laws. We're going to take away the ATA's ability to discipline their members. That's what we're going to do. Now, the ATA, in fairness, has a very different version of history. They've issued multiple statements on the situation, and what the ATA has very, very clearly said is that, to begin with, the allegations of unprofessional conduct regarding this teacher were brought to the association's attention 15 years ago. This is from an article in 2021. Those allegations did not include the sexual offenses with which he was more recently charged. The allegations made in 2006 were serious, were substantiated, and through our investigation led to the teacher being charged and ultimately found guilty. Now, that teacher lost his license to teach, and that's what happened. So he wasn't able to teach anymore. A lawsuit later came out where a boatload of students, there's estimated to be at least 200 survivors of this monster, said, hey, there's a bit more to the story. It wasn't just forcing people to eat belly button lint. It was a bunch of sexual abuse. It was a bunch of sexual assaults. It was grooming. It was all of the very bad things. And that group of people is suing not the ATA, but the CBE, the Calgary Board of Education, and the estate of this monster. Because once all of this came out, this monster took his own life. That's the situation that the UCP government felt that it was necessary to intervene on with legislative changes. But when it comes to the Stampede, which has striking similarities, where we're talking about somebody who was enabled by an organization to exist in an environment that didn't have appropriate protections in place for kids. We're talking about an organization that, even worse, was allegedly told about abuse, and the response from the representatives of the Calgary Stampede was to say, hey, that's some strong words you're throwing around there, kid. I'd be real careful with that, because you can't be one of the young Canadians if you're talking like that. The response was to threaten a child who was being abused. And when a teacher 20 years later raised similar concerns and documented them, somehow it appears nothing happened, and this individual was allowed to continue unchecked until 2014, when family went to the police. The Stampede didn't go to the police. It was family members of one of the survivors who went to the police that started this investigation. But for reasons, Danielle Smith has said, hey, you know what? We're going to continue to fund the Calgary Stampede. Now, you might be asking, how much money does the province really give to the Calgary Stampede every year? It's about $6 million. And so the question needs to be asked, how many Albertans out there are comfortable subsidizing the settlement amount, which is going to be in the millions of dollars? Almost certainly. I'm speculating, but almost certainly it's going to be in the millions of dollars. How many Albertans are comfortable helping to foot the bill for an organization that appears to, by some accounts, have covered up willfully and deliberately and using coercion against victims? Are we really that comfortable subsidizing that abuse with taxpayer dollars? Most Albertans would say no, but for some reason, Danielle Smith believes that because it's the premier festival in Alberta, no, we absolutely have to keep supporting it. It's not like this is a systemic organizational issue that permeated decades. Oh, wait, yes, it is. There's a lot of people who are offering up the excuse, well, it really should just be the board members that were responsible. Well, if you really want to say that, then you need to be aware of the fact that multiple MPs have sat on the Stampede board during that period of time. Multiple MLAs have sat on the Stampede board during that period of time. And there are 2 spaces that are reserved for city councilors to be on the Stampede board at all times. This goes over 30 years. This is not just one crappy council. This isn't just one crappy board. This is a systemic problem that existed inside of the Calgary Stampede. And while it's all good and well that they appear to be taking some measures to make things a little bit safer for the kids involved in their organizations, the kids that parents trust the Stampede to make sure are safe, it's good to see that the Calgary Stampede is making some changes. The question remains, should Alberta taxpayers, should Canadian taxpayers be subsidizing this legal settlement? Or is it maybe a good time to take a year and say, hey, Stampede, you're on your own for this one. You're not getting any taxpayer money this year. We hope that the Stampede makes the changes that it needs. We hope that the Stampede is able to remain the premier festival for the province of Alberta. But this is you, and you have to fix this. Why it is that the UCP government will go after the Alberta Teachers Association, but they refuse to try to hold the Stampede accountable is absolutely mind-blowing. But what's fascinating is when we did this episode, this topic, when we did this topic last week, one of the things that we highlighted was there was only one politician who was calling for the Stampede to be held accountable. That's changed because there's a couple of other politicians who have come forward to say that the Stampede should be held accountable, and they're really not mincing any words. So one of the strongest commentaries that we've seen comes from leader of the Green Party, Jordan Wilkie, and he doesn't pull any punches. I would never step foot in the hashtag Stampede, and nor should our tax dollars. It's wrought with abuse, child abuse, gender-based violence, animal abuse. The Calgary Stampede sexual assault scandal should be the last straw of one of the most cringe gatherings in Canada. Not pulling any punches there at all. But he's not the only one who's had some things to say, because we've got us an episode that we're going to be dropping probably on Thursday for our Patreon sponsors. It should be tomorrow, Wednesday morning at the latest. We sat down, and boy, this interview took me by surprise for some of the things that were said. We sat down with Alberta Party leader Barry Morishita, and we managed to throw together a little clip that we wanted to share about this particular instance. And we really we're going to let the clip speak for itself and then add a couple of things in. Then we're going to bring in our open mic. But this is Alberta Party leader Barry Morishita, and he's specifically addressing Danielle Smith's willingness to try to rebrand the whole situation on behalf of the Calgary Stampede.
For some reason you protect those people. It doesn't make sense. If they're, and I've seen, look how she responded with teachers. Look how the UCP responded with teachers. An incident that was properly dealt with in the confines of all of the policy and procedures that were in place at the time, was dealt with properly. They turned it into a giant political storm for their advantage, just like this. And, you know, I've tried to be, less in your face about things, less direct about, who's to be at fault, because, there's lots of things we don't know. But I guess it's come down to the fact that, if Danielle Smith believes that the Calgary Stampede is in no way responsible for what happened in this case, I think she's wrong. She's completely wrong. And she's saying it for political reasons, period. And maybe we just have to say it like that. And maybe if we say it enough times, people will start to pay attention and demand more transparency and better functioning with our governments and our political leaders.
Now, that's just a taste of what Mr. Morishita had to say. I'll be honest, I've had a couple of conversations with Barry over the last year and a half, 2 years, and he summed it up very well when he said that he has tried to be less in your face with his positions. He does not try to do that in this conversation at all. This was a very, very different, and he dropped some pretty big bombshells, and I'm not saying maybe some scoopy stuff, but there's definitely some scoopy stuff that goes on in this conversation as well. We're looking forward to bringing that to everybody on Thursday, because we're doing some adjustments for the long weekend. All of that being said, I think now it's a good time to open things up to the floor, maybe a little bit. I can see that we already have somebody who's gonna do some wonders for my blood pressure, I'm sure. But for anyone who's not familiar, if you have some thoughts that you want to share, if I've said something or we presented something on the show that you believe is inaccurate or you think is wrong, or then this is where people can hop on and I'm going to keep calling it Twitter Spaces, just like we're going to keep calling it the tweet of the day, because Elon doesn't get to take that from us. But you can hop on the Twitter Spaces, and you can tap the little microphone on the bottom left-hand side of the thing, and you can weigh in with your thoughts. We're going to start the conversation out tonight with a regular thought sharer on the program, Mr. Ziad Fazel. Ziad, how are you doing tonight, my friend?
Fine, thanks, Nate. And you?
I'm a little fired up, in case you couldn't tell.
I can tell, especially as you were speaking about the Stampede. I can see where your heart is. You covered a number of topics today, and I was hoping I could go back to one of your earlier ones.
Absolutely.
Regarding Justice Romain's decision in the Ingram v. Alberta lawsuit that came out on the 31st of July. And the reason it's something to remark on is because I feel bad for all the public health inspectors and public health officials, and I've dealt with many of them over the pandemic, who had to deal with restaurants and churches and demonstrations and all the abuse that they got when they were enforcing what they were told was properly obtained public health orders, putting in reasonable restrictions on us as individuals, restrictions on our full charter freedoms, because the point wasn't to restrict individual charter freedoms, it was to try to restrict or limit the spread of the virus. And by putting in measures like masking, by putting in capacity restrictions in churches, by limiting our ability to visit businesses and go to restaurants, the goal was to limit the spread of the virus and save our lives. So I feel bad for, and I've dealt with some of them, I've spoken with them on the phone, we've had tense discussions about it. I feel bad for all of those people who trusted the public health infrastructure, and particularly our Chief Medical Officer of Health, that the orders she was signing had been implemented in a lawful process, and they weren't. So, you know, we got a sense of this already in October 2022 in the Alberta Court of King's Bench decision in CM v. Alberta, which was the students with disabilities suing the government over prematurely lifting the school mask mandate. And that was a successful lawsuit. And in that matter, the applicants are still appealing to go further on that victory and show that the government violated the Charter of Rights and Freedoms by violating the health rights of those children with disabilities and with higher vulnerabilities. So let me just step back a little bit. Two cases. CMV Alberta was brought on behalf of disabled school children over the premature lifting of the mask mandate in schools in February 2022. And that decision came down in October 2022. And in that, the court hammered the government and the CMOH for essentially having a phony process of pretending that it was the CMOH's evidence-based decision to lift the school mask mandate and trying to cover up what happened in cabinet. And the reality is, in that case, it was the health minister Copping that made a PowerPoint presentation to cabinet. That's what the government tried to cover up. And the minutes of that cabinet meeting showed that cabinet bought it basically hook, line, and sinker. This is what the government fought hard to fought against disclosure in many dirty tricks. And real kudos to Sharon Roberts and Orla O'Kelly, who fought through all that government interference. And from filing a lawsuit in February 2022 to getting a decision in October 2022, uncovered the cover-up that the government was doing, essentially about running a fraud on us in Alberta, that the public health orders were being implemented by a lawful process when they weren't. So that's one lawsuit. The second lawsuit has been going since much earlier, since 2021, and it covers all of the public health orders, starting from the very beginning. And then they kind of cut it off in August 2021, saying, well, you can't keep amending your lawsuit to add every new public health order. But from essentially what that lawsuit is showing, Ingram v. Alberta, that's from more the lawsuit from the right wing. So it's one lawyer, Jeffrey Rath, who represents Ingram, a gym owner, and then JCCF is also part of the applicants in that lawsuit as well. So, they've been going for 2 years. They've been in appeal court. They even had a Supreme Court application denied. They've been really trying to expand the scope and basically throw all the crap against the wall and hope something sticks. And they spent a lot of money and put a lot of time into that. And they essentially got lucky from the school mask lawsuit. Because what Justice Romain did in that Ingram v. Alberta lawsuit that was decided at the end of July is she found that once again, the image that the Alberta government was giving to us, that is the CMOH making these decisions on the public health orders that she signed, saying it's my decision, it's not. Cabinet is making the decision. Essentially, Jason Kenney is making the decision, and PowerPoint presentations are being made to Cabinet, which we saw in the other lawsuit are false. So essentially, because all of the public health orders have been made by this flawed process where it's actually Cabinet deciding and the CMOH is just basically signing her prescription pad for whatever Cabinet says, all of them are ultra-virus, or which is the fancy Latin way of saying they're not lawful. And it's a real shame because what the court found in Ingram v. Alberta is all of these public health orders, I spoke at the beginning of individual rights and freedoms. There's a balancing that has to happen, and that's Section 1 of our Charter, that when a government is going to infringe on rights and freedoms like Section 2, which includes religion and freedom of association, or Section 7, which includes health, or Section 15, which includes equal treatment, the government has to have an evidence-based proper balancing of rights and freedoms versus risks. And it's a shame because in Ingram versus Alberta, looking at all of those health orders with all the crap that the applicants' lawyers threw on the wall hoping to stick, the judge still found that the public health department had done a proper balancing of rights and freedoms, saying we're infringing on Albertans' rights a little bit by having capacity restrictions in churches and by asking for masking, but it's worth it because it's lowering the spread of a disabling fatal disease, COVID-19. So the important part, which is the infringement of our rights and freedoms in order to protect our health from COVID-19, the important part was done. But the part that the government didn't do is they continued this fraud on us, that it was actually the public health official, the CMOH, who was making these decisions when it was actually Kenney and his cabinet that were making the decisions. And as a result, all those orders get thrown out. All those orders are no longer valid. So where there's tickets and enforcement mechanisms that were taking place as a result of those orders, where those public health inspectors face the heat in churches and face the heat in restaurants and, impose capacity restrictions and hours of operation restrictions, those orders, those violation tickets are the public health order behind them is void.
Yeah, and
there's going to be more litigation over that.
I think about like there's certain high profile cases where public health officials were abused and criminally harassed. I mean, like you take a look at what a certain somebody whose initials may or may not be KJJ did, and some of the legal rulings that have gone against the behaviors that he engaged in the, quite frankly, the doxing of public health officials. You take a look at how somebody like Artur Pawlowski has treated public health officials and some of the rhetoric that he's used around that, and all of these people who are involved in trying to enforce these public health orders. You're absolutely right. They did all of this work. They stood up for what was best for the public. They did so in good faith that the government wasn't messing around in the background. And it turns out the government was messing around in the background. I'd be pretty pissed off if I was them.
Now, if you'll indulge me in this a bit longer as I go forward.
Of course.
So, since 2020, especially law professors Sean Fluker, Lorian Hardcastle, and Obaka Ogbogu, all three of them law and health professors, have been warning that the government is trying to have it both ways. You know, in 2021, the government did, in 2020, the government did Bill 66, which amended the Public Health Act, but they didn't fix the issue that these legal analysts were warning about, which is that Section 29 of the Public Health Act gives the CMOH the authority and the responsibility to make decisions about restrictions. And what they were actually doing was interfering, the government was actually doing was interfering with that, and Cabinet was trying to decide the restrictions, but essentially get the CMOH to hand over her prescription pad and sign whatever it is that they decided, as if it was her decision. And they were warning about that. They're saying, if your argument is that the CMOH office itself is not capable of making these broader restrictions on the whole province, on the whole of society, and that Cabinet should be involved in that, then change the law to show that. Don't leave the law where you make it look like the CMOH is signing an order that applies to a neighborhood in a city or to a restaurant, when she's actually applying those orders to the entire province, to 4.5 million people. So if you as a cabinet are saying as elected officials, you should stand in there and make these societal changing decisions, societal changing restrictions, then change the law to give yourself the authority to do that and hold yourself accountable to it. So, you know, there's many examples on the Alberta Law blog where Professors Hardcastle and Fluker wrote about this in detail. There's Markham Hislop's COVID interviews where he interviewed Professor Hardcastle about it. Professor Ogbogu and Hardcastle wrote about this in a CBC, an op-ed, and the government never fixed it. Now we're going into the fall. We're seeing that recombinants of COVID are causing problems in the southern hemisphere, which gets its winter in our summer, and we're seeing warnings of COVID from there. We're seeing some of those variants that are tearing apart Japan and causing problems in the UK are already in Canada, in BC, for example. And we may need to have some sort of response to the resurgence of COVID. You know, the law isn't structured, the Public Health Act is not structured to take care of a resurgence of COVID.
Yeah. I'll just add to what you said there. I mean, if you go back into the breakdowns back catalog, you'll find a conversation with both Professor Hardcastle and Professor Ogbogu as well, real time at the time that it was all happening, because there were a couple of those debates that unfolded where people were saying, Jason Kenney's got to make the decision, and people like Lorian Hardcastle and Obaka Ogbogu did say, hey, you know what? That's not actually true. This is how the actual law actually works. So we did a whole series where we chatted with them, and it's fascinating to me that this is the position that government chose to take, because it seems very much like they were trying to have their cake and eat it too. They wanted to be able to make the decisions, but they thought that they were playing clever politics by using Dr. Hinshaw as political cover. The big thing, though, that I think is important to highlight on this, and this is one of the things I know it's frustrating as all hell, and I can only imagine how, like I said, those people who were doing the health enforcement, the legal scholars who were saying, "Oh, this is pretty messed up right here," how they're feeling, but the system worked. I mean, the Jason Kenney and his cabinet broke the law. They tried to have their cake and eat it too, and the people utilized the frameworks that exist inside of our society, and you know, the record's now been set straight that Jason Kenney and the UCP cabinet many of whom are still in government, I might add, they deliberately and willfully abused the legal framework in order to have their cake and eat it too. But as much as somebody, like, it sucks to watch somebody break through a store window and run off with all the jewelry, but they did get caught. Now, whether or not there's any uh, consequences for Mr. Kenny and Co. down the road, that remains to be seen, and that remains to be, it's going to be how people avail themselves of the system and how people avail themselves of making sure that everybody knows this is what happened. But I think it's really, really important to highlight the system worked. And I think it's important to highlight that as much as the freedom folks and the Coots blockaders and it's been a while since I've had fun saying the name, but the Marco van Hugenbouses of the world decided to take the law into their own hands. While it's a slow grind, it worked.
I agree with that, Nate, and I agree with the larger point you're making there too. So yes, although there were participants in the process abusing our democratic institutions, abusing the Public Health Act, the premier was, as was the CMOH. It was our democratic institutions, our courts, that worked to solve it, and the remedy is very clear. We have a statute or an act, the Public Health Act, where the flaw in the act is very obvious, and the government is being held accountable for that with two major court losses. Premier Kenny was held accountable for it with being kicked out before his term is over, and the CMH was held accountable for it. She got a huge overtime bonus while she was running this operation, but. If, let's say, she had a meritorious appointment to that Indigenous health portfolio, that was quashed. And it's our democratic institutions that need to be strengthened, rather than set aside by some ridiculous convoy-style revolution attempt. But it's strengthening our democratic institutions to behave more ethically and to kick out unethical participants than by trying to throw out our civil society, throwing out our structure of courts and accountability and laws, and democratic institutions. The solution comes in strengthening our democratic institution and punishing the unethical actors in it.
And I think that I mean, especially in the light of this court ruling, Dr. Henshaw has been found wanting. The reality is that she was elevated to a position where the exercise of this type of power was a possibility. Everybody always hopes that they don't have to, I'm sure, use that kind of power. They don't find themselves in the worst case scenarios. But she took the job knowing that the worst case scenario could potentially be happen, and she was going to be the person who was responsible for responding to that. She took the job, she took the responsibility, and when the time came for her to make the choice between doing what the job was, protecting the institutions that are supposed to keep people safe and make sure that where we're at with regards to these public health orders and the people who violated these public health orders getting off. I mean, they've got consequences in other ways, but that was part of her job, and she didn't do that job. And so as much as there's people who are pissed off at Dr. Henshaw for putting in restrictions, that's not what she should be judged for. What she should be judged for those of us who are living in glass houses, I guess, but what she should be judged for, what she should be measured on, is she signed up to do a job. And when she found that she couldn't do that job, rather than say, you know what, so long, thanks for all the fish, what she said was, I'm going to go along with it. And that's put us where we are now. I would, I'm sure that had Mr. Kenny, if Dr. Henshaw had said to Mr. Kenny, you know what, this is not how this is supposed to work, and I'm not going to play this game, I'm sure he would have found a reason to get rid of her. I'm sure that Chandra would have fired her, but he would have gotten his own way anyways. So where's the win for her?
Yeah, I remember people making excuses for her, saying that she's in there because if she doesn't stay in there, she'll get replaced with somebody worse. And my answer was always, but she's doing what the corrupt politicians are wanting anyways. So you don't get to say, well, I'm staying here because I'm ethical, and the person who could replace me could be unethical. If what you're doing is wrong, if you're giving them the unethical stuff that they want or the unlawful stuff that they want. There's a particular quote that launched the lawsuit in CMB Alberta, that launched the lawsuit on behalf of the disabled children. And that's when Dr. Hinshaw was asked by a reporter at the the weekly COVID theater briefings from the province, that it's only very recently you implemented this mask mandate and you required the school children wear the masks provided by the province, which were purportedly medical grade. And now here it is, some 4 weeks later, you're lifting the mask mandate completely and claiming that there's harms to children from this. So why did you do that? Why did you sign this new public health order? And she says, I defer to the minister on that. That's the quote that launched the lawsuit, which turned out to be successful. And she's the one that signed that public health order on February 8th, 9th, 10th, something like that. So you don't get to sign a public health order that applies or lifts major restrictions affecting people's charter rights, especially those of disabled children. And then when asked why you did that, go, I defer to the minister. Because it's not the minister that signed the public health order, it's you, Dr. Hinshaw, that signed that. And that's the quote that launched the lawsuit. And that's the lawsuit launched in February that was decided in October 2022 that in a very efficient and expeditious way fought off the government cover-up, that happened in the cabinet meeting where it was Jason Copping's PowerPoint presentation full of lies, and the minutes reflecting that, basically paved the way for the JCCF Wrath lawsuit to finally be successful about a year later. Because otherwise they were nowhere without Sharon Roberts and Orla R. Kelly exposing the government's cover-up in the earlier lawsuit.
Well, this is one of the other questions that I find myself. I wrote this down as you were talking. Just because the restrictions, the judge in the lawsuit was very clear. While the restrictions were brought in illegally, and that invalidates the restrictions, at the end of the day, the restrictions were not a violation or an inappropriate violation, didn't violate the Oakes test, of what the restrictions were. They were appropriate for the situation. They were appropriate for what was being navigated. But the other question has to be, and I think that you kind of hit on this a little bit, is, why should we have any faith that the restrictions were lifted in the same way? The judge made the ruling that the restrictions were brought in inappropriately, but the restrictions were appropriate. I'm paraphrasing. But there's been no conversation as to, was the lifting of the restrictions appropriate? And I think that there's a very difficult conversation to be had by people way smarter than me in regards to, should there have been health restrictions kept in place longer? I would argue the failure of the best summer ever would be a good indication that, yeah, probably there should have been. And certainly the residual effects on the healthcare system, as well as individual health with things like long COVID, I think that there's an argument to be made that there are restrictions that could have been more appropriate for a longer period of time. And I got to be honest with you, I'm not fully convinced that the decisions to lift, say, mask mandates inside of healthcare facilities were based on evidence. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. It's a different CMOH in this case. I don't know if they repaired the process well enough to make it look like it was the new CMOH's decision, or whether they just continued on the previous way. When it comes to the February 2022 lifting of the school mask mandates, I have access to the record of all documents that were filed in that court case. And, Nate, sometimes when I speak with you, I leave you with a teaser of stuff that I'll be working on. and so, in particular, the PowerPoint presentation that was made by made by Jason Copping to the cabinet is quite dishonest. And for example, what it would do is it'd have bullet points sort of purportedly reflecting the science of school masking. And they'd have, let's say, a bullet point that would be from SAGE in the UK, the Scientific Advisory Group in the UK, a very well-respected scientific peer-reviewed process. So they'd have a bullet point saying, SAGE says masks are important. Then they'd have a sub-bullet underneath it saying, but actually SAGE doesn't say masks are important. But that sub-bullet point is not from the SAGE publication. It's from some blogger. So time and again, they have a PowerPoint presentation with a bullet and a sub-bullet, a bullet and a sub-bullet. And the bullet is from a respected peer-reviewed publication. That's the named in the bullet. And then the sub-bullet is from some blogger or some online publication that would be kind of like a rebel kind of a thing. But they wouldn't say that it's from a different publication. So they'd make it look like
Wow.
the sub-bullet is from the primary bullet's publisher.
My buddy Dave says that the academic. Oh wow! You're killing me here, man.
Yeah. So I found that 4 or 5 times, and then it's hard to keep up with all this government wrongdoing. There's only so much time. People like me that dig into the details and then advocate from that can devote, because it's a number of civil servants working together on misleading the cabinet. And it's hard to unravel what they're doing and then communicate it properly as well, too.
Well, there's the blood pressure. Anything else you want to torture me with tonight there, sir?
No. Unfortunately, in the Ingram v. Alberta lawsuit, despite all of the resources they had, JCCF and RATH, the applicants' lawyers, didn't get the cabinet presentations behind the public health orders they were attacking. It was on a silver platter for them last summer, because we already saw from CM v. Alberta that the government was covering up the PowerPoint presentations, and then the judge in that case had ruled that the government, Tyler Shandro, our good friend, had misled the court by mischaracterizing that PowerPoint presentation and the minutes and covering it up. So they had on the silver platter to make an application for the cabinet presentations in the orders that they were attacking, and they didn't. But I think that's the solution. It's going to have to come from somewhere. For it may not be good. It may come from court applications. And somebody with deep pockets is going to have to make those court applications and fight the government's resistance, because the government didn't change. But that's where it'll come from, is exposing how fraudulent the government's presentations to cabinet were, that then underpinned the application or lifting of public health orders. I'm not sure about the masking in healthcare, because that seems to be an AHS decision as opposed to a government decision.
Oh yeah, because AHS is totally arm's length from Danielle Smith these days. There's no question Danielle Smith has absolutely no influence on the internal workings of AHS through her self-appointed, contract extended chief administrator. There's absolutely nothing but arm's length distance there. Totally, 100%.
He stands up to her, so he's tougher on her than the board was. When she replaced the board with a single administrator that reports to her. Yeah. The news is rife with all the time he disagrees with her and stands up to her. She wants to appoint a board to replace him.
There's the joke I wanted to end it on. Thanks for that, man.
Thanks for all the time.
Of course. I'm going to bring Lynn in now. And we'll see what's going on with Lynn. Lynn, how are you doing tonight? Oh, I think you need to unmute, Lynn. Oh, and it's time for Nate to vamp, I guess. Hopefully Lynn is able to make the things work. I'll do a... Oh, here we go.
Yes, I'm here.
There we go. How's it going, Lynn?
Hi, I'm good. Listen, I don't mean to circumvent you, but I know Professor Ziad's still on here. And there's been some questions in the chat about the new variant and whether we in Alberta have the ability to get more vaccines. Does he know that? Does he know about that, or can you give us some advice about how to get boosted?
I'm going to let him answer, but before I let him answer, I do have to, I feel like, throw this into the discussion. I would highly encourage everybody to talk to their GP or to their pharmacist in regards to vaccine-specific issues. So I'm going to let Ziad share his information, but I do not want to get to a place where the show is like offering by proxy or by firsthand.
No, I totally understand.
Okay, cool. So go ahead, Ziad, share what you know, but everybody please talk to your pharmacist or your doctor.
I would say talk to your pharmacist or doctor.
Okay, guys, that's what I'll do. Thanks for your information.
I would also say look at the AHS website for vaccination.
Yeah.
I do know
Thanks,
that.
guys.
I do know that both Pfizer and Novavax are reformulating their vaccines in order to take care of the recombinants of COVID that are flying around these days, and that both the U.S. And Canadian health agencies are watching for this and preparing to hopefully get good submissions from these drug companies in order to approve them in time for a fall vaccination campaign. Unfortunately, PHAC and some of these other health agencies are sort of treating COVID as a once a year in the fall vaccine kind of matter. And so they're waiting on drugs from Novavax and Pfizer with sort of updated vaccines for the new recombinants. It's definitely something to talk to your pharmacist and your GP about, because there's benefits in being vaccinated now and there's benefits in waiting for more specifically formulated vaccines.
There we go. I'm just on the AHS website, right, or the Alberta website right now. Bivalent vaccine boosters for Albertans 5 years and older are available now. The bivalent vaccine triggers a stronger immune response and provides additional protection against both Omicron and the original SARS-CoV-2 virus strains. So, I mean, I'm going to default back to the talk to your pharmacist. Make sure that you're up to date on your vaccines, and I think that probably the pharmacists, public health nurses, folks like that, those are going to be the people who are going to be best informed as to what's coming down the pipes and what people should be doing. And that's what I would say on that. See, Ed's got his hand up again.
May I just say, when it comes to the fall of this year and the restart of school of this year and the risk to children from not just COVID, but RSV and influenza, and the immune dysregulation or immune damage that has happened from prior COVID infection, even if it's just one, watch for Protect Our Province BC, who are planning to issue a letter as part of a public campaign coming out tomorrow, asking the BC government in particular to do a number of things, such as make sure vaccines are up to date, consider masking, improve indoor air quality in schools, at least monitor the CO2 levels in schools. So watch for Protect Our Province BC. POP Alberta did a great job for all of 2021 and into 2022, but then they just got burned out. They're really busy healthcare workers mainly. But POP BC has continued on. They're a great group to watch, and watch for them tomorrow. Some of the things I'm talking about, recombinants and some of the other things happening around the world, they've been monitoring, and they're going to come out with a humdinger of a letter and a PR campaign tomorrow.
Well, we'll be we'll be amplifying. I can't. I'm still struggling with the friggin' X. But we'll keep an eye out for that as well, and we'll do our very, very best to amplify that. But the other thing that I'd say is, like, in the face of we're waiting to see what's going to happen. I mean, I'm looking at mid-August. I got 2 kids, and my plan is mid-August to make sure that they're in and they're getting their boosters, because they're just about due for them, and it takes a couple of weeks for the immunity to kick in, or the protection to kick in. And I want to make sure that when they're going back to school that they have that protection. So that's obviously a conversation that we're having. But again, like, have these conversations with the GP, have these conversations with your pharmacists, because God knows sometimes you can't get into a GP. But yeah, that's what I would say to all of that. I don't think we got anybody else in the queue, and we are coming up to 10 o'clock here. So I'm gonna do the plugs and then the extra plugs, and we'll wrap it up for the evening. I want to talk a little bit about some of the episodes that we have coming up. So I've already tipped my hand with the Alberta Party leader, Barry Morishita. And again, like, I really can't stress how Barry's one of those guys that in the conversations that I've had with him in the past, I could tell that there was a little bit of fire in his belly, and I just wanted to see more of it. And he brings it in this conversation. It's a pretty intense little chat, and like I said, he drops some bombs, and there's a little bit of a scoop coming out of it. So stay tuned for that. On the news of the breakdown, we're going on a little. The last time that we took a break from the breakdown, short though it was because one of my lungs stopped working for a little while there. So we're gonna take a legit little break, but that doesn't mean we're gonna have programming. So there's not gonna be a live show next weekend because we're going on I'm going on a bit of a vacation, and that's going to give some of the team, I think, a bit of a vacation. But that doesn't mean that we don't have a couple special things planned to keep the content machine going. One of the things I'm really excited about, I had a proposal from a friend of the show a little while back, Don Slater, who is just one of the most wonderful human beings that ever human beinged. He reached out and he said, "Hey, you know what? You do a lot of talking, but you never talk about the Nate stuff. We should talk about the Nate stuff. You should do an episode where you get interviewed." And I went back to him and I said, "Well, if you're going to make that argument, then you should do the interview." And we recorded that interview today. So next Sunday, there won't be a live show, but we are going to present a conversation with myself and Don. And Don holds my feet to the fire a little bit. He also says some completely unjustified nice things, but we get to talk about some things that we wouldn't normally talk about on the show. So it's a nice little treat. A deviation. And then we also have some conversations coming up where we're going to be talking about what's happening with the curriculum, because we're going back to school in just a couple weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks-ish. So we want to talk about that a little bit. So we're gonna have some education curriculum conversations coming up as well. I don't want to tip the names because, as always, until we get the interview recorded, I don't like to write checks that my ass can't cash. But we got some stuff lined up that I'm really, really excited about. As always, our Patreon supporters will get access to all of that content a little bit early, because that's the primary perk, plus the good feeling of knowing that you're helping us to do what we do. So if you're not one of our Patreon sponsors, if you're thinking maybe, hey, you know what, I'd like to be part of that exclusive club. I am such a garbage salesperson for our Patreon site. It's laughable. You can sign up to be one of our Patreon sponsors at www.patreon.com/thebreakdownab, where for just the price of a fancy muffin or a cookie or a cup of coffee, you can help us to continue to produce the kind of content that we do. Tonight, we're actually using a tool to hopefully, we had a couple of people being, hey, your audio is a little hot. So we're trying something new to see if maybe that's resolved. We're able to do that because of our wonderful Patreon sponsors. So I want to say a big thank you to all of our Patreon sponsors. I want to say a big thank you to everybody who was active with the chat tonight. I got to say, I've been kind of bouncing in and out of the chat tonight. As always, I will read it now once the show's done. But there's a couple, there's a little bit of, I love the little bit of community that's going on in there, like the kindness and the support that was going on was really quite beautiful tonight. So I want to say thank you to everybody for being wonderful human beings in the chat there, and just being so lovely to each other. Because as much as we get a little fired up here. I certainly do. And as much as we try to have some provocative conversations, and as much as we love to make fun of people in power, it is at the end of the day ultimately about making sure that we're having conversations. So I want to say thank you to everybody there. I want to say a big thank you to Ziad for weighing in tonight. I want to say thank you to Lynn for asking her question. I want to be clear, I wasn't trying to come down too hard, but I just, there's we have I don't want to be that show. It's all I'm gonna say about that. And I think that one of the things that we need to do a much better job as overall, I certainly try to work at this on a daily basis, is to make sure that we're deferring to the appropriate experts. I mean, maybe if the Kenney government had done that, we wouldn't be having 45 minutes of the conversation that we had tonight. There's nothing wrong with listening and deferring to experts. I think it's a good thing. I got Ziad raising his hand one more time before we wrap it up. So Ziad, what do you got?
I'll just quickly say, in apology to Lynn, and also to help inform your listeners better, I just replied to your tweet announcing this space with a link to Pop BC's most recent communication. And so I'd recommend people who are listening to you follow them, because, they're experts who communicate frequently with really good information.
There you go. So do that. I thought that I'm gonna follow them right now. Thanks for that link. And I'm gonna say one other thing, because the merch jokes, we're trying to find a good drop shipper of merch that we can do cheesy merch from time to time. So if anybody knows a good low cost, low maintenance, we don't want to do that much work on it, but we have gotten requests for more merch. And Andrew's making some jokes tonight, which I love, for the record. If anybody has recommendations, send us a DM, because people ask for stuff and it's just so much work to get it printed by Vistaprint and then ship it off. It's a pain. So if there's a good recommendation for a drop shipping organization, I'm going to throw that out to our audience. Send us a DM, because we're looking for something like that. That's it for tonight and for live shows for the next 2 weeks. But like I said, I just loved the conversation with today. It was just so good. So make sure that you listen to that on Sunday. It's going to be nice to have a little break from the Alberta Politics shit show. I'm going to be taking some notes, because God knows it's not going to stop. And we'll be back in 2 weeks to talk about all of the things that hopefully I'll have some notes for. And in the meantime, take care of yourselves. The self-care thing, as always, so important. And you know what's the most important part, as always? Keep the conversation going.